In this training session, Stephanie Brooks helps us understand the purpose of ongoing monitoring activities and how to evaluate the effectiveness of service plans. Stephanie Brooks provided her bio in this way. Since middle school, I knew I wanted to work in the mental health field. After high school, I graduated from Wright State University with a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology. It was at Wright State where I first worked with children as a research assistant in the psychiatry department. Shortly after graduation, I began working as an educational and activities coordinator at an after-school program for at-risk youth in my local community for several years before moving to Florida and starting my career at Salus Care as a targeted mental health case manager for children. After almost 5 years in the case manager role, I was promoted to manage the program. I have thoroughly enjoyed the past 10 years helping my fellow coworkers, employees, patients, and their families on how to access needed treatment and resources that will help improve their overall mental health and community involvement.
Conduct ongoing monitoring activities including contact with the client, concerned others, and service providers to assess the effectiveness of the case plan strategies. It's important in case management to be monitoring the activities that you may link them to and the services also that they've been linked to. Ensure that they too know how to schedule those appointments, whereas in the beginning you may be helping them schedule them, and then it may slowly get to the point where they should be able to do it on themselves, And so you want to ensure before you discharge a client that they are following through with it, being able to do it independently, and that everything is being effective and according to the case plan strategies that you're making. Measure progress on achieving case plan outcomes. Again, this goes to, if they're going to therapy, are they starting to use their coping skills more? Are they accessing the services that you have maybe provided to them or taught them how to use, such as a bus? And just ensuring that they are actually being able to do this more independently with each conversation you're having and each visit along that assignment. Keep in mind the client's own ability for self-determination and protect the client's rights. Every client has their different ability for self-determination, and ensuring that you are working with that person based on their level of self-determination, I think is very important part of a case manager's role. The case manager keeps the roles and responsibilities of all involved persons clear. This is very important because oftentimes you have many people involved in a case, whether that is a psychiatrist, a therapist, could be teachers, could be landlords, could be multiple different people, and you want to ensure that instead of maybe everybody putting something on the case manager to do, that you're able to gracefully make those roles clear and expectations of what you're capable of doing and what they should be doing, and making sure that everyone kind of follows those roles as clearly as possible to meet the client's needs. And the case manager attends key meetings that relate to the client and have an extensive list of resources for the community to meet the needs of the consumers. Attending any meeting I have found to be helpful over the years. It's a really important time where there's a lot of communication back and forth, and the reason why people are referred to case management is maybe because they've not been able to effectively keep track of multiple different things going on or knowing exactly what to talk about at certain meetings. And being there is an important part of case management for you to interject when it's needed, or let a patient know when to speak up, so that way when you're no longer there, they realize that was the time maybe you had told them where they needed to speak up, and maybe the next time that they will. Extensive list of resources for the community to meet the needs of the consumers is important, because without these list of resources, you wouldn't be able to provide the things that you need to make your case management job a possibility. Use effective facilitation and problem-solving techniques to improve communication and relationships between all stakeholders. Again, you want to really ensure that you're being effective in your communication, so you can easily problem solve these sort of things with the people that you're working with. You want to improve the communication and not hinder it, and you want to improve those relationships. And the best way to do that is by making your points clear and concise, ensuring that the client that you're working with is able to do the same thing as you, either when you're with each other or when they're without you. And that's very important to keep all relationships in good standing. So that goes to the next point of the reconcile potentially differing points of view. You're working with multiple different stakeholders. Of course, everybody's going to have an opinion on what should be done and who should do what. And just kind of being that good mediator and ensuring that everybody is heard, and that you're able to come up with a consensus that best serves your client in the way that you're trying to serve them. Always keep in mind that the release of information forms the client has on file, and be ready to obtain new release forms from the client when new resources are going to be implemented. Every case manager should keep multiple copies of blank releases on file. You just never know when you're going to need to talk to somebody, whether somebody's requesting to talk to you about a client, the client's asking you to speak to somebody about their care. So you just want to make sure that you're always prepared and you're not having a lag between that communication and when you're able to obtain that release.
A primary part of helping involves monitoring and evaluating the effects of the helping process. We view evaluation as a major component of helping that is just as vital to the conduct of case management as all other components. An evaluation of helping provides encouragement to both the case manager and the client, and also indicates the extent to which case management goals are achieved. Tangible results form the backbone of the reinforcement process in case management. If the client is to be encouraged to move forward, he must see results. Therefore, both the case manager and client should be able to judge whether the action program is or is not being implemented, and to what degree, and the results of this implementation. Some of the procedures used to measure client change may be reactive. That is, the process of measuring or collecting data may itself contribute to client change. Reactivity can be defined as the changes in behavior that occur as a consequence of observing and recording the behavior despite or in addition to treatment interventions. A great deal of reactivity is associated with client self-monitoring measurement techniques. For example, a client may be instructed to observe and record instances of smoking cigarettes or a self-defeating behavior or self-defeating thoughts, say for 2 weeks at the beginning of the treatment session, before any treatment strategy is employed. At the end of 2 weeks, decreases in the client's smoking or self-defeating thoughts may be apparent even though the counselor has not yet implemented specific strategies to help the client reduce these behaviors. Other types of measures of client change, such as standardized tests, questionnaires, and simulated laboratory or role-play measures, also may have reactive qualities. In assessing change, be aware of the possible reactive properties of the types of measures used to monitor change. The case manager and the client are interested in assessing the degree to which the defined outcome, goal, or goal behavior has been achieved. And this is where having measurable goals comes in very handy. Because the client typically monitors the overt and covert goal behaviors, evaluation of outcomes depends upon a clear specification of the behavior, the level, and the condition of the client's goals. A case manager and a client may assess one or several goals depending upon the number of changes they have agreed to during the goal definition process, which took place after the assessment. The case manager and the client should evaluate by sampling the relationships between the target behaviors and the specific situations in which these behaviors do or do not occur. Adequate sampling of a variety of situations is required to achieve a valid representation of what is happening in the client's world. In other words, you want to see trends. The goal behaviors are evaluated by having the client assess the amount or level of the defined behavior. 5 ways commonly used to measure the direction and level of change in goal behaviors are verbal self-report, frequency counts, duration counts, rating scales, and checklists. A client may use one or a combination of these types of measurements depending on the nature of the goal and the feasibility of obtaining particular data. These measures should be individualized, particularly since they vary in the time and effort they cost the client. So let's start with verbal self-report. One way to assess the client's progress towards the goal behavior is to elicit some self-reported verbalizations. The client can provide information about the goal behaviors in response to the case manager's leads about the nature and the extent of the client's behavior, particularly outside the interview. Although client verbal reports have typically not been regarded as the most reliable measure of behavior from a purely clinical perspective, measurement that is independent of the patient's report is superfluous. However, in the realm of clinical practice, the operational criteria for the existence of problems are self-reported verbalizations. If a patient says there's a problem, then there is a problem. And conversely, when the patient claims there is no problem, then there is no problem. Therapeutic intervention is considered to be progressing to the extent that the patient or others who may be involved report that things are better, and conversely, therapeutic intervention may be considered to be of no value or even harmful as a result of the patient's and sometimes others' report. So using client verbal reports of progress is an easy and convenient type of measurement for both the case manager and the client. Client self-reports may provide useful dimensions on information about desired outcomes. However, this type of data is often vague and nonspecific to quantify. For example, a client may report, "I'm feeling less uptight now," but may not know how much the anxious feelings have decreased in amount, number, or severity. Because of this, client verbal reports are usually supplemented with some other types of measurements that may produce more specific and quantifiable data, such as frequency counts and duration counts. Frequency counts reflect the number of how many or how often of overt and covert behaviors. Frequency counts involve obtaining measures of each occurrence of the goal behavior, and they're typically used when the goal behavior is discrete or of short duration. The number of panic episodes experienced or the number of pounds lost are examples of behaviors that can be monitored with frequency counts. Sometimes frequency counts should be obtained as a percentage data. For example, knowing the number of times a behavior occurred may not be meaningful unless data also are available on the number of possible occurrences of the behavior. It's recommended that percentage measures be obtained when it's important to determine the number of opportunities to perform the target behavior, as well as the number of times the behavior actually occurs. For example, data about the number of times an overweight client consumes snacks might be more informative if expressed as a percentage. In this example, the denominator would reflect the number of opportunities the person had to eat snacks, and the numerator would indicate the number of times the person actually did snack. The advantage of percentage scores is that they indicate whether the change is a function of an increase or a decrease in the number of opportunities to perform the behavior or an actual increase or decrease in the number of times the response occurs. Thus, a percentage score may give more accurate and more complete information than a simple frequency count. However, when it's hard to detect the available opportunities or when it's difficult for the client to collect data, percentage scores may not be useful. Duration counts reflect the amount of time or the length of time a particular response or collection of responses occur. The duration measurement is appropriate whenever the goal behavior is not discrete or lasts for varying periods. Thinking about one's strengths for a certain period of time, the amount of time spent on a task or with another person, the period of time for depressive thoughts, and the amount of time that anxious feelings lasted are examples of behaviors that can be measured with duration counts. Another type of duration count involves observing the latency of a particular response. The number of minutes before falling asleep is an example of a latency response. Another is the amount of time that elapsed before self-disclosing to another person or in a group. Duration and latency measures can be used in combination. For example, a client can record both the latency of self-disclosing responses and the duration of those responses. Observing the latency of a response provides useful information about the target behavior, even though the data may not always be precise. For example, clients often overestimate sleep latency. If the client can obtain information about response latency using a timer or a clock, then the data are more likely to be accurate. Rating scales is another way of measuring. The intensity or degree of the goal behavior can be assessed with a rating scale. For example, intensity of anxious feelings can be measured with ratings of 1, not anxious, all the way to 5, panic. 3 ways of decreasing sources of error frequently associated with rating scales are: first, the helper should be certain what it is to be rated, as well as defined and specified in the client's language. That means you want to be specific about what you're rating. For example, if a client is to rate depressed thoughts, the case manager and the client specify with examples what constitutes depressed thoughts. And this is where, again, your goals and objectives are measurable and specific. So you may find a client who says, well, nothing is going right for me. I can't do anything right. These definitions should be tailored to each client based on an analysis of the client's problem behavior and contributing condition. Second, rating scales should be designed so that there is a description for each point on the scale. For example, episodes of anxious feelings in a particular setting can be rated on a 5-point scale, with 1 representing little or no anxiety, 2 equal to some anxiety, 3 being moderate anxiety, 4 representing strong anxious feelings, and 5 indicating very strong or intense anxiety. Third, rating scale should be unidirectional, starting with 0 or 1. Negative points or points below 0 should not be included. Also, the case manager should consider the range of points in constructing the scale. There should be at least 4 points and no more than 7. A scale less than 4 points may limit a person's capacity to discriminate, whereas a scale that includes more than 7 points may not be rated reliably by the client because there's too many discriminations that are required. And checklists. Checklists are similar to rating scales. The basic difference is that the type of judgment one makes. On a rating scale, a person can indicate the degree to which a behavior is present. A checklist simply measures the presence or absence of a behavior. Checklists describe clusters or collections of behaviors that a client may demonstrate. A checklist assesses the client's capability to emit a particular behavior to a given standard under a given condition. For example, suppose a case manager used a checklist for teaching a person job interview skills. The nonverbal and verbal behaviors associated with demonstrating appropriate job interview skills can be listed on a checklist. If a client demonstrates a specific behavior in a naturalistic or simulated situation, he or she would receive a check on a list for that particular behavior. A checklist can also be used in conjunction with frequency and duration counts and rating scales. The state of Florida requires an outcome measure on every client who comes to the agency. This form identifies demographics and functioning information on clients during an episode of care for both mental health or substance abuse services. The state DCF or Medicaid office tracks the type of clients that are being served, the functioning of the patients over a course of treatment, and uses the information to identify patient populations, community or agency needs, and long-term treatment effectiveness. Outcomes also demonstrate or prove the agency's effectiveness to stakeholders. The outcome provides valuable information on patient needs and functioning at admission and continuing through the course of treatment. This also helps you set treatment goals and objectives during the episode of care, and then at discharge helps to identify the effectiveness of treatment and identifies further needs and referrals that may be needed. Outcomes are submitted by clinical staff on all patients who receive mental health or substance abuse services funded in whole or in part by the state DCF contract or with Medicaid. Mental health outcomes are completed at the time of the patient's first mental health service, and then every 3 months, and then again at the time of discharge. There are also 2 other assessments used called CFARS, which is the Children's Functional Assessment Rating Scale, and FARS, a Functional Assessment Rating Scale, which is used with adults. And these are also completed at the time of the first service, every 6 months, and at discharge, or whenever a significant change occurs in functioning. We'll talk more about these later. Substance abuse outcomes are completed at the time of the first service and at discharge. Some of the information that's collected on these outcome measures includes how the patient was referred, their primary source of income, whether or not they have a psychiatric disability income, how they were admitted to the agency and their legal status, their diagnosis, their residential status, employment status, their highest level of education, how many days they've spent in the community, the number of days they've worked or perhaps gone to school if they're a child, and a risk factor, disability factors, whether or not the patient has met Baker Act criteria in the past 30 days, and if the patient received atypical antipsychotic medication. It also assesses school attendance for kids and the number of rest in the last 30 days for all patients. So the outcome measure is very important to agency data as well as the individual patient's data, and you'll get more training on this within your program. Another Florida outcome that is required for clients is the Functional Assessment Rating Scales. The one for adults is called the FARS, F-A-R-S, and the one for children is called the CFARS. And in order to accomplish these assessments, you have to have training, and there is training devised by the state of Florida. And at the end of that training, you get a Rater ID number, which you carry with you for any jobs that you have in Florida. You can even put that on your resume as your Rater ID number. And this training will be held in more depth with you in your program, especially the training. Once you take the training, if you have any additional questions, please see your supervisor. In review, goals are established to assure that the quality services are provided at an appropriate level of care for each client. And the monitoring determines this and also looks at whether or not the services are provided in a timely and logical fashion, and whether the services enable the client to move forward with their plan. We measure on the dimensions of effort, adequacy, quality, and outcomes, and these measures can either be informal or formal, as we discussed. However, just keep in mind that monitoring is an ongoing process. It's not something you do at one appointment every 3 months. It's an ongoing process. You actually have a monitoring process at the beginning and perhaps the end of every encounter with the patient. It requires the client's cooperation. As a case management, you're the coordinator for all of these monitoring activities. And you focus on whether the plan is being implemented and the services are being carried out. You focus on whether the entire process of the program elements help the client achieve the expected goals, the goals that the client stated they wanted to achieve. So this ends the section on monitoring and evaluation of service plan goals. Please take the test, and remember a 70% completion rate is required. Thank you.